Substance as subject. If you have heard about Hegel, you have heard about this. It is one of the most enigmatic and famous phrases from Hegel. Besides the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, this is one of the most well-known pieces of Hegel, and also one of the most unknown. Generally, people have no clue what this means at all. They know that this is connected to some spooky thing called spirit. They don't know what it really means. Has something to do with God. Has something to do with the absolute. But every time I've heard anybody try to explain this, it's awful. The funny thing is, it is supremely simple and easy to explain it, if you know how it works. Believe me when I say that it doesn't take years to understand this. As a matter of fact, it's not like I read all of Hegel and then went, wow, now I get it. I didn't even get to the end of phenomenology. I read the first two chapters of the Science of Logic, I figured out what the method was, and I went back to the phenomenology of spirit, read the preface, and with a careful eye, keeping track of everything that Hegel says and mentions, conceptually and structurally, I figured it out. Not very hard at all. It doesn't take years. I didn't even go read secondary literature on this because up to then, secondary literature had completely failed, and I had no clue what they were really talking about. This isn't boasting, by the way. It's funny because you don't even need Hegelese. Hegel is actually very mundane and clear about this. You'll see what I mean. So going with the phenomenology translation by Miller, in the preface, Hegel makes some quick, dense, and seemingly unintelligible equations of certain terms. In section 22, 37, and 54 of the Miller translation, Hegel makes a boggling rundown of conceptual equivalences that, to the uninitiated and uncareful, must appear as utterly unintelligible nonsense. What does Hegel do? He basically ends up making this astonishing chain of equivalencies. Reason is purpose, is self-movement, is subject, is negativity, is being for self, is immediacy, is becoming, is concept, is actuality, is substance, is being in itself. Pretty long, sounds Hegelese, sounds complicated. Not complicated, actually. Let's break it down. In section 22, Hegel says reason is purposive activity, and that purpose is what is both unmoved and is self-moving, and this is subjectivity. Not only that, but this power of self-movement is negativity, and this negativity is the self. This actually isn't that unintelligible if one merely slows down. That reason is purpose is not a crazy idea. Indeed, when you ask for the reason for something, you're usually asking for the purpose for which it is. Purpose being self-moving is also not strange, for purpose, in a sense, seems to be self-realizing in that something purposive begins with its purpose in potential and ends with its purpose actualized. You begin with purpose, you end with purpose. Purpose makes purpose real. That Hegel calls this self-movement subjectivity, however, is definitely something that won't find much traction in the section. We are told of it and Hegel swiftly races on. It isn't an absurd notion, however, when we think of it in a very broad sense. Our subjectivity, as we understand it in regular life, is fundamentally tied to our own self-movement as free agents to do whatever it is that we want to do. Hence, that self-movement is in some basic sense subjectivity is understandable. After all, think about it this way. When I do things as a subject, I do things because of myself, my own subjectivity. Subjectivity moves itself. If it was moved by something else, it would not be because of me. It would be because of my brain neurons, physics, what have you, magic, doesn't matter. The point is, the subject moves itself. It is not moved by anything else. It is the cause of something else. If my action was moved or caused by something else, it would not be my action. I would be the object acted upon by something else. That self-movement is negativity is definitely strange if one is not thinking of negation and instead thinks of negativity in the sense of negative and positive, good or bad. But with negation in mind, it's quite clear why this equivalence is made. That which moves itself must somehow be negating its state of being to change it. Negativity as the self-movement of purpose as a whole, Hegel tells us, is just what the self is. Quote, "The self is the sameness and simplicity that relates itself to itself." End quote. Because purpose relates itself both as its beginning and end, and negativity likewise negates whatever it produces, and in that sense also relates itself to itself. It is the negation of negation. This equivalence is formally intelligible, even if we have little clue what Hegel really means in these concepts. Now you may say, well, that's not what I mean by self. Sure, it is not the entirety of what you mean by self, but it is a part of what the meaning of the self is. Take, for example, the self-determination of the self. In our choosing to be who we are, in making ourselves, we necessarily relate ourselves to ourselves. In creating ourselves, we negate ourselves. We change ourselves to become who we wish to be. If someone fails to achieve this self-relation and self-determination, self-changing capacity, are they really a self? Is there really a person there? Or are they someone else's puppets? Or are they something else's puppets? Perhaps a puppet of physics. Think about it. But let's move on. In section 37, Hegel brings all of what he states in section 22 to continue the chain of conceptual connections. Hegel elaborates an addition to negativity. It is now the distinction between the I and the substance it investigates. How does that work? Well, in order for me to be the I opposed to the substance, there has to be a negation. There has to be negativity between us. How are we differentiated? Through a negativity. In this section, Hegel elaborates on the meaning of substance as subject. The negativity which separates the I and substance is the very power that is the I in the animating soul of substance. This negativity, constitutive of substance, though Hegel does not mention it, is at its most basic determinateness, the being of something by not being another something. Substance is in disparity with itself, shows negativity active within it, and negativity is constitutive of substance's very being. This is how Hegel cashes out the original enigmatic claim. Substance is subject because it has negativity. Absolute negativity. It negates itself. It splits itself, differentiates itself, becomes determinate, endures as an object through its own self-negating power. Therefore, substance is simply the still image of subjectivity. To put it in simpler terms, a thing is as it does. Quote, "When it has shown this completely, spirit has made its existence identical with its essence. It has itself for its object just as it is, and the abstract element of immediacy, and of the separation of knowing and truth, is overcome. Being is then absolutely mediated. It is a substantial content which is just as immediately the property of the I. It is self-like or the notion, concept." End quote. To skip a bit ahead in the phenomenology, spirit in the end shall find nothing but itself in its objects of investigation. The reason is already clear in one sense. First, because spirit too is negativity and the I. Secondly, and this shall be shown in the next section, because spirit is thought and its knowledge of objects is their very notion, their concept. And lastly, because as Hegel intends to show beyond the phenomenology in his actual philosophy, the entire system of knowledge is one absolute system united and moved by negativity. Finally, in section 54, Hegel brings forth for a moment the concepts of identity and thought. Quote, "The subsistence or substance of anything that exists is its self-identity, for a failure of self-identity would be its dissolution. Self-identity, however, is pure abstraction. But this is thinking." End quote. Self-identity is the locus of being that keeps substance together. Self-identity is also pure abstraction in the literal sense. It rips substance away from any connections and determinations, and as Hegel has already told us earlier in the preface, abstraction is thought. Being, he goes on, is thought. This is meant literally and not in any metaphorical way. Being really is thought, for it is a concept of abstraction. Yet, it is a thought that certainly applies to existent beings despite its poverty of meaning. But Hegel means something even more radical than simply saying being is just a thought. No, to be is to be a thought in the sense that to be is to be abstracted. From the absolute standpoint, the absolute must negate itself, create difference in itself, and in creating that difference, the oppositions stand against each other as separate. They are literally abstracted. But as already noted, abstraction is thought. So don't confuse thinking and thought to be mental for Hegel. They are not. They are not our subjective mental phenomena, nor are they the mental phenomena of some God mind. Thought is merely a concept to describe this abstraction which things show for themselves. So, here Hegel makes a claim that this is the solution to the problem of how being and thought are one. Quote, "Now, since the subsistence of an existent thing is a self-identity or pure abstraction, it is the abstraction of itself from itself, or it is itself its lack of self-identity and its dissolution, its own inwardness and withdrawal into itself, its own becoming." End quote. Things are, they subsist through their self-identity or pure abstraction, which is through the power of self-negation. This abstraction, however, is itself a difference. Self-identity is only possible through difference. After all, if there were no difference, there would be no identity to be spoken of. A could not even enact the fact of A equals A. But if being as substance can split itself from itself, then it can become other to itself. It can become self-opposed. It can become its own opposite. But in becoming its own opposite, it would dissolve itself as the identity that it was, and it would become another. But if substance is as it does, and its doing is itself negating, then substance would only be its own becoming. Becoming is vanishing, and since self-identity and abstraction is its own dissolution, for if identity is abstracted and opposed through its opposition, it is difference. Therefore, it is no longer self-identical. It is its own vanishing. The power of negativity appears freely from it. Substance's self-identity is its own negativity, its own subjectivity. Because substance is in its own self-negation, as soon as it is not. Becoming is the truth of substance, the truth of its own subjectivity. It is the truth of its own self-determination, for self-determination is its own self-negation. This is its own free self-movement and development via its negativity, a power which allows it to go beyond itself and link to what is different, yet freely inherent to it. Thus, substance constantly dissolves its boundaries, goes beyond itself, only to return to itself freely. This movement broadly maps the path of spirit which goes beyond itself, only to find itself. The process of the negative returns back to the negative. The self links back to itself and completes its absolute unity. Some of the equivalencies aside, it goes to show that Hegel really has something interesting to say in all these seemingly bizarre terms and phrases. However, he was unable to explain them due to the constraints of a preface, and well, it demands a lot of us as readers. It demands that we be very careful. It demands that we keep things in mind. It demands that we be very charitable. Because in this preface, actually, Hegel doesn't talk in Hegelese very much. If one simply takes an everyday view of things, it can make perfectly good sense. So, that is substance as subject. Substance is subject because substance is merely the enduring image of this endless activity which relates to itself. This endless activity acting upon itself from the outside simply seems as a completed, stable, enduring circle. To give an image, Hegel's substance as subject is like a ball on a string spinning so fast that we cannot tell that it actually isn't just a solid circular wheel. But concepts are not spatial-temporal. They don't take time to complete. The activity of thought in the realm of thought has always already been done. Eternally completed, these concepts are the frozen image of a thinking that has always already gone by. What we see in this realm of logical thought is not a dead thing. It is a process that is endless and always already complete. The process of thinking subsists and endures eternally. All right, this has been Antonio Wolf. Thank you for listening. Leave comments if you find it useful, if you find it confusing, if you want to know anything more, questions, go ahead.